Welcome to Godless and Grounded. Imagine living in the 1st century. The Roman Empire rules with iron fists. The followers of a new and suspicious sect called Christianity are being hunted, mocked, and crucified. The dream of a coming kingdom of God feels like the only hope for those crushed under Roman boots. Out of this fear, this chaos, and this need for meaning, comes one of the strangest and most violent books ever written, the Book of Revelation. For centuries, it has terrified believers, inspired prophets, and confused scholars. Some say it is divine prophecy, a window into the future of humanity. Others see it as the fever dream of a man broken by persecution. But when we really look at the evidence, at the history, and at what this book actually says, we begin to realize Revelation might not be prophecy at all. It might simply be an ancient cry of desperation disguised as divine revelation. The Book of Revelation was written around 95 AD by someone who calls himself John. Christians like to say this: John was the Apostle John, the disciple of Jesus, but historians disagree. The Greek style, the vocabulary, and even the theology are completely different from the Gospel of John and the letters of John. In short, whoever wrote Revelation was not the same man. He was likely a Jewish Christian living in exile on the island of Patmos, probably after being banished by Roman authorities for stirring trouble. So, the writer was angry, frightened, and isolated, a perfect recipe for apocalyptic visions. Now, what does this book actually describe? Beasts with 7 heads, dragons, angels pouring bowls of wrath, stars falling to earth, the sea turning to blood, locusts with human faces, and a final cosmic war called Armageddon. Even by ancient standards, this is extreme imagery. The question is, why would a divine being use such confusing and violent symbols to communicate with humans? If God wanted to send a message about the future, would he really do it through codes and monsters instead of a clear explanation? The truth is, Revelation fits perfectly into a long tradition of Jewish apocalyptic writing. Books like Daniel, Ezekiel, and parts of Isaiah also use strange beasts and cosmic visions. They were written during times of oppression, when people needed to believe that God would soon destroy their enemies. So Revelation was not a unique Christian prophecy. It was a copy of a familiar formula, coded political protest written as divine vision. For example, the beast with 7 heads is not some futuristic dictator. It clearly symbolizes the Roman Empire, which was famously built on 7 hills. The number 666, often feared as the number of the beast, can actually be translated through ancient Hebrew numerology to mean Nero Caesar, the Roman emperor notorious for burning Christians. So Revelation was not predicting a future Antichrist. It was taking revenge on Nero and Rome through symbolic storytelling. That alone shows how human this book is. It was not divine foresight. It was political resistance hidden under religious language. But over the centuries, people forgot the context. They took the symbolism literally. The book that once gave hope to 1st century rebels turned into a manual for modern doomsday cults. Every generation since then has believed that Revelation was describing their own time. In the Middle Ages, Christians were sure the beast was Islam. In the 1500s, Protestants said it was the Pope. In the 1900s, preachers said it was Hitler, then the Soviet Union, then the European Union, and now some say it is the microchip or artificial intelligence. Every time the prophecy fails, people simply change the interpretation and keep believing. That is not prophecy. That is wishful thinking dressed in divine language. If Revelation were truly prophetic, it would have made at least one clear, verifiable prediction that came true. But nothing in it has. The stars did not fall. The earth was not destroyed. Jesus did not return riding on the clouds. The New Jerusalem did not descend from the sky. 2,000 years later, life goes on as usual. Farmers still plant seeds, children still go to school, and preachers still insist the end is near, even though near has now lasted 20 centuries. This obsession with Revelation has also shaped modern politics in dangerous ways. In the United States, millions of evangelical Christians believe they are living in the end times. They vote and act based on that belief. Some even push for wars in the Middle East, thinking conflict there will trigger Christ's return. Imagine that. Ancient symbolic writing guiding modern nuclear policy. All because one man's hallucination was mistaken for divine revelation. Let us also talk about the psychological aspect. The book's author describes seeing beasts, angels, and cosmic battles. But what if what he saw were not visions from God, but symptoms of trauma or delusion? Scholars have pointed out that the descriptions match patterns of hallucination caused by fasting, isolation, or even epilepsy. The island of Patmos was not exactly a mental health resort. John might have been starving, dehydrated, and terrified, conditions that make the human brain produce vivid hallucinations. If someone today wrote a book claiming to have seen monsters and dragons during isolation, we would not call it prophecy. We would call it psychosis. But when it happens 2,000 years ago, we call it scripture. Another thing to note is the author's obsession with revenge. The entire book is filled with wrath, blood, and punishment. God is shown killing billions, burning the earth, and rewarding only a small group who obey him blindly. This is not love or mercy. It is pure authoritarian fantasy. The writer wanted his enemies, the Romans and anyone who doubted, to suffer. That is not prophecy. That is vengeance wrapped in religion. Even Jesus in the Gospels never described such violent endings. When asked about the end of the world, Jesus said, "No one knows the day or hour." He spoke about peace, forgiveness, and spiritual rebirth, not dragons and blood rivers. Revelation stands in total contradiction to the message of the Gospels. So, if Christians claim both are divine truth, they must explain why God suddenly changed his tone from love to mass slaughter. The simplest answer is that the author of Revelation was not continuing Jesus' message. He was rewriting it for his own time, using fear as the main weapon. Now, let us look at how Revelation became part of the Bible. For centuries, even early Christians were unsure if it should be included. The church in the East rejected it. Many bishops called it too confusing and dangerous. It was only much later, when the Roman Church consolidated power, that Revelation was officially added to the canon. Why? Because it served political purpose. A text describing divine wrath against unbelievers was a useful tool for control. Fear is powerful. It keeps people obedient. If you can convince people that God will destroy them for disobedience, you never need real evidence. You just need the threat of apocalypse. That threat continues today. Every disaster, war, pandemic, or earthquake becomes a sign of the end. When COVID struck, televangelists said Revelation predicted it. When Russia invaded Ukraine, preachers said it was the war of Gog and Magog. Every time, believers are convinced the end is finally here. But the end never comes. The only thing that ends is reason. It is interesting to see how Revelation keeps people trapped in fear rather than awakening them. It teaches believers to wait for rescue instead of improving life on earth. Why care about climate change, poverty, or injustice if the world is ending soon anyway? That mindset kills progress. It turns faith into fatalism. If we strip away the divine label, what we find is actually a very human story. A man under persecution dreamed that his suffering would end with divine revenge. He wrote those dreams down in wild poetic symbols. Over time, those dreams were copied, translated, and turned into Holy Scripture. Then generation after generation used those words to fuel fear, control, and wars. That is not prophecy. That is history repeating itself. Revelation is often called the apocalypse, but the Greek word apocalypsis simply means unveiling or revelation. Ironically, instead of unveiling truth, this book has covered it with centuries of superstition. It has become a mirror showing how far humans will go to avoid accepting mortality. The end of the world is easier to imagine than the end of our own lives. So we keep inventing cosmic endings, hoping it will give our small existence some grand purpose. The most dangerous part of Revelation is not the monsters or plagues. It is the idea that destruction is necessary for salvation. It teaches that the world must burn for good to triumph. That logic has inspired countless fanatics, from medieval crusaders to modern terrorists who believe killing in the name of faith brings divine favor. When destruction becomes holy, humanity becomes disposable. Maybe the real revelation is not about the future at all. Maybe it is about us. About how fear shapes belief, how suffering breeds visions, and how humans turn despair into divine promises. Revelation is not predicting the end. It is describing the psychology of people who cannot accept that the world simply goes on without divine intervention. And that, perhaps, is the most human delusion of all. Let us continue. Throughout history, people have been obsessed with the end of the world. The Book of Revelation gave them the perfect script: beasts, plagues, wars, and a final battle between good and evil. Every generation since the 1st century has tried to insert itself into that story. Every generation believed it was living in the last days. Yet here we are, 2,000 years later, still waiting for an ending that never arrives. In the year 1000, people across Europe gathered in churches, convinced that Jesus would return at midnight. When the sun rose the next day, priests said the calendar must have been wrong. Then they waited for the next round number. In the 1800s, an American preacher named William Miller calculated that the world would end in 1844. His followers sold their homes, quit their jobs, and climbed hills to watch the sky. The day came, the sky stayed empty, and that event became known as the Great Disappointment. Yet instead of abandoning the idea, they reinterpreted it. Out of that failure came new sects like the Seventh-day Adventists and later the Jehovah's Witnesses, all built on the same logic that if the prophecy fails, the date must simply be misunderstood, not wrong. In the 20th century, televangelists like Hal Lindsey and later Tim LaHaye sold millions of books claiming Revelation was unfolding before our eyes. Lindsey said the world would end before the year 2000. LaHaye's Left Behind series turned apocalypse into entertainment, making fear profitable. Millions bought those books and movies, thinking they were preparing for rapture. Instead, they were just funding another industry built on divine panic. Even now, YouTube and TikTok are full of preachers decoding every war and earthquake as the final trumpet. They call it prophecy, but it is really pattern-seeking, the same psychological habit that makes us see shapes in clouds. Humans crave meaning. When chaos strikes, we invent cosmic reasons. Revelation gives those reasons ready-made, decorated with dragons and angels. But here's the irony. If Revelation were truly divine, it would not need decoding. It would not require endless reinterpretation by every generation. Truth stands clear. Only confusion requires constant translation. Let's think logically for a moment. If an all-knowing God wanted to warn humanity about the future, would he do it through riddles written in Greek code? Would he describe the fall of empires through beasts and horns instead of names and dates? Would he use metaphors so vague that people can apply them to anything from Rome to AI? No reasonable teacher communicates like that. The simplest explanation is that the author was not describing the future at all. He was describing his present, the oppression, the violence, and the despair of his own time. And yet, that ancient paranoia keeps echoing today. When the Cold War began, Americans saw Revelation in every nuclear missile. When Y2K came, they saw it in every computer glitch. When COVID spread, they said the mark of the beast was the vaccine. Fear evolves, but the root remains the same. Revelation taught people to expect doom, not to question it. Now imagine how many lives and decisions have been shaped by that fear. Politicians in America openly say that climate change is irrelevant because the world will end soon anyway. Pastors tell their followers not to worry about the planet because God will destroy it and replace it with a new one. That kind of belief does not bring hope. It kills responsibility. It excuses destruction. Revelation's biggest damage is not theological. It is moral. It replaces human accountability with divine inevitability. Let's look at how that plays out in real life. When an earthquake happens, a rational person asks how to prevent future damage, how to strengthen buildings, how to save lives. A believer obsessed with Revelation says it is a sign of the end and waits for angels. One response saves people, the other waits for miracles. This is why blind belief is dangerous. It replaces action with expectation. The same thing happens in wars. When Israel and Palestine clash, Christian extremists in the West see it as the Battle of Armageddon. They actually want the conflict to continue, because they think it will bring Jesus back. That means they support bloodshed not because of justice, but because of prophecy. This is how ancient fiction fuels modern violence. But there is another layer to this. Revelation also created a profitable market for fear. Religious media, prophecy books, and apocalyptic films all use the same formula. Scare people, then sell them comfort. It is the oldest marketing strategy in history. Create a problem, then sell the solution. In this case, the problem is divine wrath, and the solution is faith, donations, and loyalty. You can see the same psychology in cults. Take the Heaven's Gate group in the 1990s. Their leader told followers that a spaceship behind a comet would take them to heaven before Earth's destruction. He quoted Revelation as proof. They believed him, and ended their lives in ritual suicide. That is not prophecy at work. That is revelation inspiring delusion. Another example is the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. Their leader, David Koresh, claimed to be the Lamb from Revelation. He stockpiled weapons, prepared for the final battle, and convinced dozens of people to die with him. All from one book written 2 millennia ago by a man on an island. These tragedies are not random. They are logical outcomes of teaching that the world must end in fire for good to triumph. Revelation romanticizes destruction. It makes violence feel sacred. But beyond all that, there is a deeper question. Why do humans even want an apocalypse? Why do we crave endings instead of solutions? Maybe because the idea of divine judgment gives meaning to suffering. It turns chaos into story. It makes people feel that their pain has purpose, that all injustice will be balanced someday. It is a comforting illusion that someone is keeping score, that the world will be fixed by supernatural intervention. But comfort is not truth. The truth is that the world changes only when humans act. Revelation has kept believers focused on heaven instead of humanity. It has made them wait for a hero instead of becoming one. That is how religion sustains itself. Now let us address another question believers often ask. But what if revelation is symbolic of spiritual truth, not literal events? That sounds humble, but it still avoids the problem. If it is symbolic, then it is not prophecy. And if it is not prophecy, then it cannot prove divine inspiration. At best, it becomes a work of literature. Interesting, emotional, maybe even poetic, but still human. And if it is human, then it deserves analysis, not worship. Think of how we treat other ancient texts. When we read Homer's Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh, we recognize mythology. We admire the art but do not build our foreign policy on it. We do not threaten people with eternal fire for questioning it. Revelation should be seen the same way, as ancient literature, not divine law. Some believers say, but so much of Revelation has come true. They point to wars, earthquakes, and disease. But those things have always existed. Predicting war and disaster is not prophecy. It is observation. It is like predicting that humans will keep breathing. The book says there will be famine, plague, and conflict. Of course there will. That is the human condition. Real prophecy would mean specific, measurable events, names, dates, outcomes, that could not be guessed by coincidence. Revelation has none of that. Instead, it uses vague, symbolic language that can fit any era. That is why it keeps surviving. It is flexible enough to always seem relevant, but never clear enough to be proven wrong. It is the perfect survival mechanism for a false prophecy, always adjustable, never testable. When science explains natural disasters, prophecy shrinks. When astronomy shows the true nature of stars, the idea of them falling to Earth becomes absurd. When we understand psychology, visions lose their magic. The more knowledge we gain, the smaller revelation looks. That is not coincidence. Truth does not fear evidence. Only lies do. The irony is that the book which claimed to reveal everything hides behind mystery. It says, "Blessed are those who read this prophecy," but for 2,000 years, no one has understood it the same way. If that is divine communication, it is a terrible one. A God who truly loved humanity would not speak through riddles of wrath. He would speak clearly, through compassion, reason, and evidence. But Revelation offers none of that. Only chaos and fear. So where does that leave us? If Revelation is not divine, then what is its value? Maybe as a window into human psychology. It shows what happens when fear and faith combine under pressure. It shows how people under tyranny dream of cosmic revenge. It shows how myths evolve from pain. Understanding that is not an attack on faith. It is an act of honesty. And perhaps the real revelation, the one worth holding on to, is that we do not need divine threats to live morally. We do not need beasts and trumpets to make us care about the world. The end of the world is not coming from the sky. It is something we create ourselves when ignorance replaces empathy, when blind faith silences reason. If humanity ever faces an apocalypse, it will not be divine. It will be human, born of greed, superstition, and the refusal to think. So maybe it is time we put down Revelation and write a new one. Not with beasts and angels, but with truth and understanding. Not about the end of the world, but about the beginning of reason. Because the real prophecy, if there ever was one, is simple. The world will end when we stop thinking, and it will begin again when we start.